If you stand beneath a midday sun, a sharp, dark shape will stretch across the ground beneath you, mimicking your every movement with flawless precision. We call this a shadow, and we treat it as nothing more than a trivial consequence of geometry. The mundane absence of light, where a physical body happens to block its path. But if you look closer, a quiet, unsettling paradox begins to emerge. Your shadow is entirely flat, a two-dimensional projection draped over the contours of a three-dimensional world. It has no depth, no mass, and no physical weight. Yet it exists because of your solid presence. Now, stretch that logic upward. If a three-dimensional object casts a two-dimensional shadow, what does a four-dimensional object cast? In the rigorous mathematics of spatial dimensions, the shadow of a four-dimensional entity is not flat. It is a fully realized, three-dimensional volume. It has depth. It occupies space. To an observer trapped in a lower dimension, that shadow would look and feel entirely solid. This raises a haunting possibility. What if your physical body, the flesh, bone, and breath you define as yourself, is not the primary actor in this reality? What if you are actually a higher dimensional entity, and the physical form you inhabit is merely the three-dimensional shadow you cast onto the fabric of our universe? Under this light, the dark silhouette on the pavement is not a separate thing at all. It is the lowest, most degraded edge of a vast multidimensional structure, stretching from a realm we cannot see down to the flat concrete. Your shadow might literally be the only part of you that touches another dimension. And if our true selves are anchored somewhere beyond our perception, it explains why the physical world behaves so strangely the moment we turn our backs on it. For decades, quantum physicists have wrestled with a deeply unsettling truth. The universe seems to shift, dissolve, and rearrange itself the moment we stop observing it. It is as if reality itself is a projection that only crystallizes into solid form when an observer demands it. To understand how deeply this mystery penetrates our daily lives, we have to look closely at what actually happens when we look away from the world. We like to think of reality as an ancient solid house. The walls are made of stone, the floors of heavy oak, and the roof of slate. We assume that when we leave a room and close the door behind us, the furniture remains exactly where we left it, bathed in the quiet dark. We believe that our presence is merely passive, that we are late arrivals to a pre-existing universe that would continue spinning perfectly well without us. Yet, when we peer into the foundational layers of matter, this comforting assumption evaporates. The subatomic particles that make up the stone walls and the oak floors do not exist as solid points when they are left alone. Instead, they exist as waves of probability, cloudy, mathematical smears of potential that occupy multiple places at the same time. They are everywhere and nowhere, waiting in a state of suspended animation. The moment a conscious observer measures them, or even looks in their direction, these cloudy waves instantly collapse into highly localized, solid points. The act of looking seems to force the universe to make a decision. It is as if the cosmos is a highly efficient rendering engine, only drawing the details of the room. When a player walks through the door, leaving the rest of the world as a formless, unrendered code in the dark. This phenomenon, known to physics as the measurement problem, is not a minor quirk of the microscopic world. It is a fundamental crack in our understanding of objective reality. It suggests that the universe is not a collection of independent things, but a dynamic relationship. Matter and consciousness are locked in a silent, perpetual dance, where one cannot exist in a definite state without the attention of the other. Why would reality require our participation to become real? If we trace this question to its logical limit, we find ourselves looking back at the nature of dimensions. Consider a flat, two-dimensional world, a plane of paper inhabited by two-dimensional beings who can only move forward, backward, left, and right. To these flat creatures, a three-dimensional object, like an apple passing through their paper universe, would appear as a series of surreal, changing shapes. First, a tiny point would materialize out of nowhere. It would then expand into a solid, widening disk, shrink back down, and suddenly vanish without a trace. The flat inhabitants would document this event as a miraculous violation of the laws of physics. They would calculate the shifting boundaries of the object, write complex equations to predict its behavior, and debate its meaning. But they would be entirely blind to the true nature of the event. They could not see the apple as a singular, whole, three-dimensional structure because their eyes and minds are locked in a lower plane. They can only perceive the slices of the apple that intersect with their flat slice of reality. We find ourselves in a remarkably similar position. We experience time as a linear sequence of moments, flowing from the past through the present and into the future. We experience space as three coordinates, but modern physics suggests that space and time are woven together into a four-dimensional fabric called space-time, where the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. If this block universe is real, then your entire life, from your first breath to your last, already exists as a singular, massive, unchanging four-dimensional sculpture. You are not a tiny point moving through time. You are a vast, sprawling entity of which the present moment is merely a single, three-dimensional slice. Just as the flat beings only see a shifting slice of the apple, we only see a shifting slice of ourselves as we drift through the medium of time. If our physical bodies are merely three-dimensional slices of a higher dimensional structure, then the act of observation takes on an entirely new meaning. When you observe a quantum particle, you are not simply looking at a tiny ball of matter. You are intersecting with it. Your consciousness, which may itself be a higher dimensional phenomenon, is choosing which slice of the quantum wave function to experience. The moment you look away, that connection is severed. The particle relaxes back into its native state, a multidimensional wave of potential that spreads out across the unseen dimensions of reality. It is only when you re-establish contact, when you stretch your perception back out to touch it, that it is forced to project itself back into our three-dimensional theater. Your shadow, then, becomes a profound metaphor for this entire cosmic arrangement. It is the boundary where a higher dimensional object meets a lower dimensional surface. It is a bridge made of absence, a physical proof that there are structures in this universe too large, too complex, and too deep to fit into the narrow space we call the physical world. Every time you walk down a sunlit street, you are participating in this dimensional hierarchy. Your three-dimensional body casts a two-dimensional shadow. But what is casting the three-dimensional shadow that is you? What higher dimensional presence is standing in a light we cannot perceive, projecting your life, your thoughts, and your very physical form onto the three-dimensional screen of our universe? We must ask ourselves, if the physical world is merely a projection that changes the moment we stop looking, what is the nature of the light that casts us into existence, and where does our true self actually reside when the observation ends? To understand how our reality dissolves when we are not looking, we must first dismantle our deep-seated understanding of what it means to observe. In the everyday world, looking at something seems completely passive. You open your eyes, light bounces off a coffee mug, enters your pupil, and your brain decodes the image. The mug remains entirely unaffected by your gaze. It is a one-way street of information, but at the foundational level of reality, this passivity is an illusion. To observe is to participate, to disturb, and ultimately to construct. In the language of physics, a measurement is not merely a glance. It is a physical interaction. To see a subatomic particle, we must bounce a photon of light off it. Because the particle is incredibly small, that tiny photon acts like a cosmic wrecking ball, instantly altering the particle's speed, direction, and state. This physical disruption is often blamed for the collapse of the quantum wave function, suggesting the mystery is nothing more than a mechanical limitation of our instruments. But when we push this experiment to its conceptual limits, the mechanical explanation begins to fail. Physicists have designed sophisticated, delayed choice experiments, where the decision to observe a particle is made after the particle has already committed to a path. Incredibly, the particle behaves as if it knew the future decision of the observer, retroactively rewriting its history to match the choice made in the present. This defies our basic understanding of time and causality. It suggests that the act of observation does not just push things around, it determines the very nature of past events. The observer is not a passive spectator standing outside the arena of nature, but the active editor of the cosmic script. This deep connection between mind and matter gains a staggering new perspective when we look at the universe through the lens of the holographic principle, developed in the study of black holes. This mind-bending theory suggests that all the information contained within a volume of space can actually be mapped onto the boundary of that space. In simpler terms, everything we experience in our three-dimensional world, including ourselves, might be a holographic projection generated from a flat, two-dimensional boundary at the very edge of the universe. If this principle holds true, it completely upends our intuitive hierarchy of what is real. We naturally assume that the solid, three-dimensional object is the true reality, and the flat, two-dimensional shadow is the cheap imitation. but the mathematics of the holographic principle suggests the exact opposite. The flat boundary, the two-dimensional shadow, is where the actual information lives. The solid, three-dimensional world we inhabit is the projection, an incredibly detailed illusion cast into the interior of the cosmic bubble. When you look at your shadow stretching across the ground, you may not be looking at a mere byproduct of your physical presence. You might be looking at a small, localized representation of how the entire cosmos is organized. The shadow is the code, the body is the display. The moment we stop observing a region of space, we are not simply closing our eyes to a pre-existing scene. We are temporarily pausing the holographic projection. Without our consciousness acting as the beam of light that decodes the flat information, the three-dimensional rendering collapses back into its native state of unmanifested potential. This explains the profound silence and emptiness that seems to linger just behind our backs. We live with the constant, unshakable intuition that the world exists behind us exactly as it does in front of us. But this is a psychological projection, a protective mechanism of the mind. The brain is an extraordinarily advanced prediction machine, constantly synthesizing a seamless, logical environment so that we do not panic. It fills in the blanks of the unobserved world with memories, expectations, and probability. If we could somehow turn our heads faster than the rendering speed of the universe, what would we see? We would not see an empty room or a dark void. We would see a state of pure, undivided potential, the formless, raw material of reality before it is sliced into the categories of space, time, and matter by the blade of our perception. It is our awareness that acts as the anchor, dragging this sea of infinite possibilities down into a single, concrete experience. But if our consciousness possesses such immense power to collapse waves of probability and materialize solid space, we are left with a deeper, more intimate question. Where does this awareness come from? If our physical brains are made of the very same quantum particles that require observation to become real, then the brain itself cannot be the source of consciousness. A shadow cannot cast a shadow of its own. There must be an observer standing outside the system, a primary source of light that remains unseen while making all else visible. If our physical bodies are three-dimensional slices of a vast, multidimensional structure, then our consciousness must also be rooted in that higher realm. Our brains are not generators of awareness, but biological reduction valves, lenses designed to focus a limitless, multidimensional consciousness into a tiny, localized point of view. We are like deep-sea divers wearing heavy, restrictive suits. The suit limits our vision, slows our movements, and forces us to experience the ocean through a narrow visor. We begin to identify completely with the suit, forgetting the wide, sunlit world above the surface from which we descended. In the same way, we identify with our three-dimensional physical forms, completely unaware that our true higher dimensional selves are standing in a light we cannot see, casting these solid shadows into the physical deep. To venture further into this mystery, we must step out of the laboratory and into the quiet halls of human memory. Long before quantum mechanics drafted its first equations, Our ancestors felt the weight of the dimensional divide. They did not have the vocabulary of wave function collapse or holographic projections, but they possessed a profound symbolic language that pointed to the exact same hidden architecture of reality. In ancient mythologies across the globe, the shadow was never treated as a mere optical trick. It was regarded as a distinct, vital component of the human soul. The ancient Egyptians called this shadow self the Sheut. They believed it held a concentrated essence of a person's true being, acting as a graphic print of their spiritual identity. To the Egyptians, a person could not exist without their shadow, and the shadow could not exist without the person. They were two ends of an invisible, unbroken thread. When a human died, the Sheut was thought to travel into the underworld, navigating a landscape of shifting geometry that the physical body could never enter. This ancient intuition aligns perfectly with our dimensional metaphor. The Egyptians understood that what we see in the physical mirror is only a fraction of what we are. They recognized that the dark, flat silhouette tracking our steps on the sand is a physical messenger, a visual proof of an unseen partner lurking in a domain just beyond our sensory reach. If we look at this through a psychological lens, we find this same structure mirrored in the deep work of Carl Jung. Jung brought the concept of the shadow into modern psychology, defining it as the dark, unlit reservoir of the psyche, the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or fail to observe. Just as physical particles remain in a state of chaotic potential when left unobserved in the dark, the psychological shadow remains a wild, unpredictable force when we refuse to look at it. It is only when we turn the light of conscious awareness inward, when we bravely observe the dark corners of our own minds, that these chaotic, psychic potentials collapse into integrated, constructive aspects of our identity. The act of psychological observation is literally an act of creation. By looking at the unobserved parts of ourselves, we organize the formless noise of the subconscious into a solid, functional self. To see this architectural relationship in its most famous form, we must return to the dawn of Western philosophy, Plato's allegory of the cave. Plato asked us to imagine a group of prisoners chained inside a dark, underground cavern since childhood. Their heads are fixed, forced to stare only at a blank stone wall in front of them. Behind them, a great fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners, puppeteers carry various objects along a raised path. The shapes of these objects cast sharp, moving shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners. Having never seen anything else, the prisoners naturally believe that those flat, dark shapes are the only real things in existence. They name them, study their movements, and predict their patterns. If a prisoner were suddenly freed, turned around, and forced to look at the actual objects and the blinding fire, they would suffer intense pain. Their eyes, accustomed to the dim, flat world of the wall, would refuse to accept the brilliant, three-dimensional reality before them. They would beg to turn back to the comforting, simple shadows on the stone. For over 2 millennia, we have read this allegory as a political or educational metaphor, but under the light of modern dimensional physics, Plato's cave reads like an incredibly accurate description of our physical universe. We are those prisoners, the three-dimensional space we inhabit. The room you are sitting in right now, the device in your hands, the solid earth beneath your feet, is the stone wall of the cave. The objects we chase and define as real are merely the three-dimensional shadows cast by a higher dimensional reality we cannot perceive. Our physical senses are the chains, locking our attention forward, keeping us blind to the brilliant, higher dimensional fire burning just behind our backs. When we observe the world, we are attempting to make sense of the shadows on the wall. But the moment we stop observing, the shadows fade. The wall goes quiet, returning to the unrendered darkness of the cave. The true, higher dimensional entities carrying the objects behind us remain entirely unaffected, standing in the light of a sun we have yet to discover. This realization permanently shifts our understanding of our place in the cosmos. We are not fragile, temporary accidents of biology clinging to a cold rock, spinning through a meaningless void. We are vast, multi-dimensional voyagers whose true coordinates are anchored in a higher plane of existence. We have merely forgotten how to look behind ourselves. But if we are indeed higher dimensional beings casting these physical shadows, how do we begin to bridge the gap? How do we translate this profound philosophical realization into the practical, lived experience of a human life? If our physical bodies are indeed three-dimensional projections of a higher dimensional reality, then this is not just a fascinating concept to debate in quiet rooms. It is a practical truth that reshapes how we navigate our daily lives. The realization that reality is a fluid relationship, not a rigid, static machine, completely alters how we experience our physical limitations, our environment, and our personal agency. Think of how we typically approach change. When we want to transform our lives, we usually try to move the physical pieces around. We focus entirely on the shadow. We manipulate our environments, force physical habits, and fight against the solid objects on the stone wall of our daily experience. But trying to change your life by only manipulating the physical world is like trying to change a shadow on the wall by grabbing the dark silhouette itself. It is a frustrating, exhausting struggle against a projection. To change the shadow, you must move the object casting it. You must shift the higher dimensional source. In human terms, this means realizing that your thoughts, intentions, and states of consciousness are not mere byproducts of your physical brain. They are the active coordinate shifts of your higher dimensional self. When you change your deep internal alignment, you change the angle of the light. Consequently, the three-dimensional shadow of your physical circumstances is forced to rearrange itself to match the new projection. This gives us a profound new way to understand the concept of flow states, those rare, luminous moments when athletes, artists, or thinkers feel time dissolve and their actions occur with effortless perfection. In a flow state, we often say we feel connected to something larger. Perhaps we are. By quietening the analytical mind, the biological valve that strictly filters our perception down to linear, three-dimensional survival, We temporarily widen our bandwidth. We allow the higher dimensional structure of our true self to guide our physical actions. We stop fighting the boundaries of the shadow and begin to move from the source. Furthermore, this perspective changes our relationship with the unobserved spaces of our lives. When you walk away from a project, a difficult relationship, or a creative problem, you are not leaving it in a static, frozen state. You are releasing it back into the quantum wave function, the realm of pure potential. This explains the strange phenomenon of creative incubation, where the answer to a complex problem suddenly appears in your mind the moment you stop actively thinking about it. When you stop staring at the shadow, you stop forcing it to collapse into the same tired, predictable shape. By looking away, you allow the problem to expand back into a multi-dimensional cloud of possibilities, reorganizing itself in the dark until it is ready to materialize as a brilliant, unexpected realization the moment you look back. We must also confront how this perspective alters our understanding of physical aging and decay. To our three-dimensional eyes, a human body slowly breaks down, wrinkles, and fades over time. It feels like a tragedy of biology, an inevitable slide into nothingness. But if your life is a singular, four-dimensional sculpture existing completely in space-time, then your youth, your middle age, and your old age are all permanent, coexisting features of your true structure. An artist's brushstroke does not cease to exist just because the eye has moved to the other side of the canvas. Your childhood is not gone. It is simply located at a different coordinate along your higher dimensional timeline. Every moment of your joy, your grief, your triumph, and your quiet reflection is permanently etched into the fabric of the universe, standing solid and whole in a light we cannot physically see. We are merely the travelers walking through the halls of our own grand design, shining the narrow flashlight of our current awareness onto one room at a time. If this dimensional architecture is the true layout of our existence, then what happens when the physical body can no longer sustain the projection? What is the final transformative destination of this journey? And what awaits us when the three-dimensional shadow finally dissolves back into the light that cast it? The dissolution of the physical body is perhaps the most terrifying boundary we face, a dark threshold that we traditionally call the end. But in a universe built of dimensional projections, this boundary is not a termination. It is a release. It is the moment the three-dimensional shadow simply folds back into the higher dimensional source that cast it all along. When a shadow on the wall disappears because the light has changed or the object has moved, we do not weep for the shadow as if a real entity has been destroyed. We understand that the information, the structure, and the presence that created the shadow remain completely intact. The shadow was merely a temporary intersection between a physical presence and a flat surface. In the same way, the fading of our physical form is not an exit into nothingness, but a return to wholeness. It is the collapsing of the projection, the awakening of the traveler, from the narrow, restricted dream of the cave back into the brilliant, boundless reality of the fire. This understanding forces us to look at the universe with a sense of profound, quiet awe. The next time you find yourself alone in the deep, silent hours of the night, perhaps at 3 a.m., when the world feels strangely thin and the usual noise of human activity has completely faded, pay attention to the stillness. In those quiet moments, the rendering engine of our daily lives seems to slow down. The solid, predictable walls of our reality, they feel less like permanent stone and more like a soft, translucent veil. You can almost feel the presence of the vast, unobserved wave functions waiting in the dark just beyond your perception, vibrating with infinite potential. You are not a passive spectator trapped in a cold, indifferent machine. You are a sovereign participant in a grand, multi-dimensional architecture. Your attention is a creative force. Your consciousness is the light that co-creates the world, and your physical body, traveling through the medium of time, is a beautiful, temporary masterpiece, a three-dimensional silhouette cast by an eternal traveler. As we step back into the brilliant, busy rush of our everyday lives, we are left with one final, quiet realization to carry with us. If the physical world is merely a projection that changes the moment we stop observing it, and if your shadow is indeed the only part of you that touches another dimension, then perhaps we have never truly been separated from the infinite. Perhaps we have never left home at all. If this is true, what else have we never questioned?